Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Daniel Ragsdale, who is the Vice President and Architect at 26 Technologies. Before this role, he was Principal Director for Cyber in the Department of Defense's Research and Engineering Office. He was also a Program Manager for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA, and he spent 30 years in uniform as an officer in the United States Army. He holds a PhD and master's degree in computer science. And he also prefers to go by Rags. Rags, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, it's great to be here. I give my highest regards for putting this together. I've had the opportunity to listen to some of your previous podcasts, and you've got together a panoply of experts and addressing a critically important topic. So thank you for the opportunity.
You have a multi-decade perspective on national security, especially related to military matters. What is your general assessment of great power competition in which we find ourselves?
Just about 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to come back to the Department of Defense. I had drawn a DoD paycheck for the better part of 35 plus years and had gone away and had helped establish the cybersecurity program at Texas A&M and was asked to come back to come to the Pentagon to focus on cyber technologies in the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And it was that we were developed on the heels of the publication of National Defense Strategy in 2018. And in there, we made it was very clear that we are in an age of great power competition. And we very specifically focused on our great power competitors. And I think that's, as we look back on this period of time, as history looks back on this period of time, I think we awoke to a circumstance where for the better part of 2 decades, we had focused on extremist groups and all of the challenges that presented our nation and our military over the better part of 2 decades. But in that period of time, our focus on extremist groups, I believe in some respects, had us take our eye off the ball. That we are in an era of great power competition. We know that both China and Russia are aggressively pursuing military capabilities that they believe could outstrip our overmatching capabilities that we believe that we possess for the better part of nearly a century. So we do find ourselves in an era of great power competition. And fortunately, the Department of Defense and really from a whole nation perspective, we are focusing on those great power competitors. Our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has made it very clear that China is the pacing threat. They are increasingly aggressive, and at the same time, they're also increasingly engaged. So they see themselves, and they are attempting to position themselves as the singular global power within the next 30 to 40 years. And that's a potential threat that we can't ignore. And fortunately, we are aggressively addressing that particular threat. Now, the interesting thing about China's current perspective is it's frankly not new at all. So we know from the writings of Sun Tzu that many of the activities that China's involved in are very much aligned with the perspective that Sun Tzu brought to things. Certainly their focus on winning without fighting. So while they are developing an impressive military capability and investing in the aggressive development of technologies that, much like us, there's a dual use to them. So certainly their focus has been on dealing with what previously we have been a technologically superior opponent. So they have looked for ways to expand the notion of warfare. And there's a document that I have held close for the better part of over 2 decades now that I encountered just prior to my assignment to West Point, and it's a document entitled Unrestricted Warfare. It was written by two PLA colonels, and it spoke about the operational art in the area of in the era of globalization, and in part they used it as a basis to describe how China could defeat a technologically superior opponent, the United States at that time, through a variety of means by expanding their notion of warfare. So instead of a direct military confrontation, they looked at other ways, whether it be through political means, whether it be through legal means, whether it be through economic means, whether it be through information or cyber means, to address the threat that they perceived that the United States presented them. And as we look, that's in effect has been their playbook. That has been their playbook, as that they've looked to compete with us across those other dimensions. And in doing so, we find ourselves now, and they find themselves now, in a position where they have made some headway across all of those dimensions, but at the same time, they are in a vastly different place with respect to the superiority, their inferiority, if you will, with respect to military capabilities. It's very clear, both on open source reporting, that they are developing significant military capabilities that they believe will allow them to compete in a very direct way, if necessary, with the United States. So yes, we do find ourselves in an era of great power competition. Yes, we as a nation and we as a Department of Defense have acknowledged that threat. And fortunately, we're taking actions that I believe will put us in a better position over time with respect to that increasing threat. So despite all of the challenge that we now face, despite the fact that it's very clear that that China in particular will have overmatching military capability, I'm actually increasingly bullish in terms of our ability to address those very real threats and have sufficient and credible deterrence that's based on our own strength and real capabilities across all the instruments of national power.
Yeah, that's great. Follow up on one item you mentioned, that pamphlet or book, Unrestricted Warfare. Is that document available publicly, as far as you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's publicly available. It's actually been published. It was available, I believe, on Amazon. It's a recommended read for those that are trying to get their head around the approach, the multidimensional approach that China has taken with respect to competing with the United States over time.
Yeah. As you recall, does it touch upon China's three warfares philosophy and items like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well,
so it's not brand new thinking, and frankly, right. I'll be honest, the translation probably could be better, but you can't help but come away with the strong impression that they, at the time, perceived themselves to be militarily inferior. So they were looking, well, how do we compete? And they looked at other dimensions of influence, other instruments of power that clearly they've made some headroads. And at the same time, as we well know, their military capabilities are substantially enhanced over that period of time. So in combination, they continue to take a broad perspective with respect to competition and conflict, but they also have enhanced military capabilities.
Right. I'd also like to rewind and go back to your bio for just a moment as well. Could you give a beat on the Department of Defense's Research and Engineering Office? There may be people in our audience that are unfamiliar with what that office does.
Yeah, so right up front, I have to give great credit to departed Senator John McCain. It was basically at his initiative that the former AT&L, Advanced Acquisition Technology and Logistics, was broken up. So now we have the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. We have a Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And the reason for that breakup was to make sure that we had significantly increased focus on those technologies that would provide us leap ahead capabilities. In 2018, USD R&E was formed, and its focus was on the research and engineering activities that the department must focus on in a unified and coherent sense if we were going to leverage increasingly mature technologies, and most importantly, leverage the integration of those increasingly mature technologies to provide the capabilities we know our force needed. So the central aspect of USD R&E, I'm a little biased, I was a former principal director for cyber, is they created 11 positions for principal directors for the modernization priorities. Those modernization priorities came from, with very few exceptions, directly out of the National Defense Strategy of 2018. And there are many of the usual suspects that you would expect that the department would focus on. So, for example, hypersonics, directed energy, space, cyber, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum science, microelectronics, autonomy. And we also added to the mix 5G, or think of that more as next G. So those are technology areas that we as a department knew that we had to place specific focus and energies against in order to ensure that as those technologies became increasingly mature, we could directly leverage them and integrate them to provide this leap ahead capability that we know will be central to what the joint force needs in the out years. Now, to further reinforce the importance of those critical senior officials in those technology areas, in the most recent NDAA, they specifically directed that the department not only identify the senior officials, but they gave them very specific responsibilities with respect to the development of roadmaps, with respect to having oversight of all engineering, prototyping, and experimentation across those areas. And what I will tell you is it was just, frankly, the honor of a lifetime to see my colleagues in their respective areas of responsibility provide true oversight and pull together capabilities that we all know that the services are resourced to man, train, and equip the force. So the majority of S&T dollars go to the services. But what I saw very specifically in the context of my activities with my colleagues is that they were able to create OSD level activities, and in some cases programs, where the services could see the value of aligning themselves with those OSD level initiatives, and they could leverage. And in one particular instance that I think is especially enlightening, we clearly have in our principal director for directed energy, he's responsible for both laser technologies and high-powered microwaves. There is a OSD level program that is allowing the service to go much further, much faster than they otherwise would have been able to do independently by virtue of leveraging the OSD level, OSD investments. So USD R&E is laser focused on, and those principal directors on what we talk about as illuminating the boundaries of the realm of the possible to influence not just concept development, future concepts, but to inform future decisions about S&T, about engineering, about prototyping and experimentation. And just want to quickly highlight that last phrase, prototyping and experimentation. The department is putting increasing focus on experimentation and prototypes to the point where They're looking for leave behind prototypes because they believe this will be a means for us to ensure that we could rapidly develop and deploy capabilities. Because if we have a shortcoming, as the department, is we still are too slow moving, we're still too methodical, we are still, in some respects, too bureaucratic. So to the extent that we could rapidly deploy advanced capabilities that are leveraging the integration of increasingly mature technologies will put us in much better stead.
All right. Well, thanks for all that. And more follow-up questions. Could you contrast USD R&E that you just got finished illuminating for us? Contrast that with DARPA. It could be really easy to conflate the two.
Well, so the conflation is very real because actually DARPA is part of USD R&E. When they brought USD R&E into being, I didn't give the full details. I gave a perspective from the seat that I sat in. Both DARPA and the Missile Defense Agency and the Space Defense Agency, for that matter, are part of USD R&E. USD R&E, just to give the fulsome discussion of who they are, there's actually 3 DDR&E, so Defense Research and Engineering, or Directors for Defense Research and Engineering. One is for advanced capabilities, and they are obviously very, very interested in developing the engineering, but also the experimentation and prototyping. They are more to the pointy tip of the spear. They are, helping to bridge that valley of death, for example, that is so very real in terms of, we develop a lot of things in the lab, but they don't always find their way out to a field environment. Also, there's a Director of Defense Research and Engineering for research and technology. So they're more of the basic research that 6.1 and in some respects it's 6.2 or even into 6.3 focus, because we can't, at the same time as we've got to rapidly deploy relatively mature capability, we can't lose sight of the fact that the department must continue to invest in basic research. And so the DDR&E for research and technology focuses in that area. Now, the DDR&E for modernization, he or she is responsible for, and that was a position that I had the good fortune to serve in for about 5 months during the transition in an acting capacity. So that individual has oversight over the 11 principal directors and for those modernization areas. And in addition to the 3 DDR&Es, as I mentioned, DARPA is part of the team, as is MDA, as is the Space Defense Agency. So you can see all of the S&T infrastructure or S&T enterprise at the OSD level is under the purview of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And we directly leverage all the activities that are going on in DARPA. But at the same time, we're very engaged with the services, the service labs, and the rest of the S&T enterprise. And should go without saying, we're very directly involved with our colleagues in acquisition and sustainment. So we want to make sure that with the creation of this new undersecretary, there's not a seam that develops. Actually, in some respects, if not done properly, could exacerbate that valley of death problem. So we work, and I keep saying we, it's so close to me because I've recently departed the department, but my former colleagues work very closely with their colleagues in acquisition and sustainment, because it is when capabilities transition from out of the S&T labs and bridge that valley of death and find their way into future systems providing overmatching capability, there's obviously an acquisition and sustainment portion of that.
All right. Well, you have really illuminated the whole research and engineering, science and technology, and acquisition and sustainment landscape there. A very important capability, going from like a back of the napkin idea all the way to capability that is in the hands of operators. So how has information come, percolated up into everybody's consciousness over the last few years as you've been immersed in this world?
So it's a fabulous question. Clearly, there's a greater appreciation for information as one of those instruments of power, both not just within the Department of Defense, but across the whole nation. So yeah, I mentioned the National Defense Strategy of 2018, and that was really it was a seminal document. Many of these strategies often find their way onto bookshelves and not really significantly consequential in terms of the impact on our activities. That was not true for the NDS 2018. And frankly, for that matter, the National Defense Strategy that will soon be published for the current administration, I believe will likely have a similar impact. But what that the NDS 2018 said, it focused our activities. It brought some focus to our activities in a way that maybe previous NDSs didn't. The prior National Defense Strategy had, I believe, 9 goals, and I have a school of thought that says if you have 9 of anything, you have nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And so the 3 goals in the 2018 NDS said that focused on the importance of having increased lethality, the importance of reforming our activities, and the importance of partnering. Now, this focus on lethality is, in part, for those that are looking into the department, aren't we much more than that? And certainly, in the Department of Defense, our goal is to deter adversaries through strength. But to have a credible deterrence, you have to be strong. And frankly, the nature of warfare is such that we have to be able to have the capability to deliver lethal means. But at the same time, that does not mean that we ever endeavor to or desire to use those means. But to serve as a credible deterrent, we have to have the strength. And I think that that's very clearly articulated in the National Defense Strategy. At the same time, while focusing on lethality, partnerships, and reform, we also acknowledge that there are other instruments of power. So we look at as the national instruments of power, whether it be diplomacy, information, military, economic. As the department, clearly we're very focused on the military capabilities. But if you were to poll senior leaders in the COCOMs, or for that matter, senior leaders in the Pentagon, they would all acknowledge that our strength in the case of a potential future conflict needs to be paramount. In the fight tonight, we are in an information fight. Let there be no doubt that they're very much engaged in a very concerted effort to ensure that we are competing with our great power competitors in the information domain. And consequently, we've got to have information operations capabilities that could address the very real threat that our great power competitors present in that particular domain. It's very clear that Russia and China, in different ways, have weaponized the information domain, that they are aggressively involved in information operations on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. And that is a very real threat to the United States and our national security interests. So yes, the department is increasingly focused on information operations. Many of your listeners may be aware that in a recent National Defense Authorization Act, the department was directed to designate within the department a principal information operations advisor who would work directly for and advise the Secretary of Defense himself in the area of the information operations. We fortunately are not only increasingly focused on having that capability within the department, but we're within the Department of Defense. But we're working very closely with the Department of State in this particular area, because if we've had challenges, in part it's due to our reasonably risk averse nature in this space, in that gain approval for the conduct of some of these activities the timelines would be so extended as to limit their impact. So we have both enhanced authorities as a department, and we have enhanced engagement with the Department of State to ensure that we could engage in fulsome information operations that effectively get our message out there. And many of the discussions that I've heard have talked about how we should counter adversary misinformation and disinformation. What I'm increasingly hearing, though, is not just countering, but proactively getting out ahead of our adversaries' information operations, which are very, very, very real, very consequential. We've seen them time and time again on certainly both China and Russia that have used a variety of means to weaponize, in particular, social media in ways that have had influence domestically and internationally, often with misinformation or even worse so, disinformation that is wholly objectively untrue, but is influencing both American citizens and the citizens of nations, whether they be allies, traditional partners, or others. So it is an area of increasing focus within the department, and I think that's wholly appropriate and should put us in better stead going forward.
Right. And I should have mentioned at the top, we're recording this on August 18th, 2021, and you just left the Department of Defense within the last couple of months. Is that right? So
that's correct.
All of this is a very current assessment and recap of the landscape there within this technology adoption prototyping world for the Department of Defense. You started talking a bit about, some collaborations with other agencies outside of DoD, Department of State, for example, but I'd like to get your take on collaborations and partnerships in general. Your time and again on this podcast forum, we've talked about the value of partnerships today more than ever. And so things like, are we engaging sufficiently, appropriately with the commercial sector? What about with our Five Eye and NATO allies? Could you take a moment to explore that space a little bit with us?
Yeah, I sure will. And it comes back I will preface this by saying risk aversion is part of the challenge. So there is, as we go down this path, there will be those individuals, leaders, and organizations that will need to accept some risk as we increase our engagement with the private sector on the one hand, with other interagency departments, with our allies and partners. And so I'll go in reverse there and talk about our allies. Mm-hmm. We certainly are saying the right words with respect to our engagement with our allies and our traditional partners. It is very difficult, as you can well imagine, to ensure that while we have wonderful, trustworthy relationships with our particularly with our allies and our Five Eye partners and others, you assume risk when you share information, particularly, mm-hmm. From a cyber perspective. Someone need not be necessarily even careless in their handling of information that could, even if they're not careless, could still be disclosed, putting information that we believe could be a real and present threat to our national security interests. Mm-hmm. So we have to assume some risk. And frankly, I think our appetite for risk has to be increased. So I'll just say that just flat. We still have, I believe, inappropriate risk aversion because the threats are very real, and we do have traditional partners and allies that anything that pushes us apart is going to work at our counter purposes. So there's a little bit of a COVID aspect to our engagement with others, physical presence, being able to travel to and engage directly with our partners is actually part of this. And that's been limited to some extent over the course of, the pandemic.
You mean our inability recently to get kneecap to kneecap with people has been a bit of an inhibitor? Is that what you're saying?
I would say absolutely. No question about it. No question about it. When it comes to, we're back to trust again. I believe that there is an enhanced ability to engage in trustworthy communication face to face. So to the extent that we've been limited in that through the pandemic has made it even that much more difficult. With respect to partnerships with the private sector, clearly you can see what I consider to be very interesting progress in terms of where I've said I'm bullish in a lot of respects with respect to. So let's talk about cyber for just an example, because there's a clear connection between the two. We've got some of the very best, most knowledgeable subject matter experts, but even more importantly, leaders in important positions. So Chris Inglis, as you know, was recently confirmed to be the National Cybersecurity Director. And Jen Easterly, and I've known Chris for decades. They just don't come any better. He's forgotten so much more than I or most of us will ever know about how to be more secure across the cyber domain. Jen Easterly, don't know her quite as well as I know Chris, but she's over at CISA and DHS doing the work of the Lord. I really believe we're going to see some tremendous enhancements there as the Department of Homeland Security works more closely with the Department of Defense. I see some of that last shift. She came from the Department of Defense. She's a retired Army colonel, worked directly with General Paul Nakasone in a previous role. I'm a huge fan, frankly, of Ann Neuberger and her role in the National Security Council. She came from the NSA Cybersecurity Directorate. She was involved in very important and consequential operations before she was the director of NSA Cybersecurity Directorate. And then Rob Joyce, who succeeded her at the NSA Cybersecurity Director. So these are four of the paramount experts and great leaders in very important roles in the cyber domain. And what's nice about this is that we have people that have been in multiple settings. So that will enhance the opportunity, I believe, for and increase the likelihood that there'll be better collaboration across interagency. Because you hear the pablum whole of government. It's going to require a whole of government approach. The department alone can't carry the day in the information domain, and there is an inextricable connection between cyber and information. When we look at information operations, I always start off with, what are the domains, cyber right up front in my mind, as far as I'm concerned. We speak about PSYOPs, we speak about military deception, we speak about OPSEC, strategic communications. But if you think of information operation, there's a message and then there's a means of delivery. Increasingly, at least the means of delivery is going to be through some cyber means. And more to the point of this gets back to my initial point about how I'm feeling somewhat bullish, is I mentioned the department is more focused on the information domain and the information environment. And one of the things they did, like who's gonna be in charge of these operations, right? So who's gonna lead, and the COCOMs, clearly, as I mentioned before, they're in this. They have ongoing information operations today and tonight. But it is the cyber commands in each of the services and U.S. cyber commands that have embraced information operations. And I think that's to our benefit, right? Now, they can't do the whole piece. It's not just cyber alone. Cyber clearly provides a means through which, a medium, if you will. But the message, the crafting of the message is not necessarily, we don't have exquisite skills at sufficient scale within the department. So this is where our connective tissue to the State Department is important. And it also connects to why we have to be engaged with the private sector, right? Because we know there's a fabulous marketing technology enterprise that US-based companies have perfected, right? And while we are not China, so we don't have a total fusion of civil and military, and should never, because that's not who we are. We have to find ways to directly leverage the capabilities, in some respects, the technology that is being developed by the private sector for marketing, right? I mean, and to assess the impact of our information campaigns. And we shouldn't, while some of our methods, by their very nature, should not be commonly shared, there's some of our method we could be very upfront with respect to. We have a message, a truth-based message that we want to facilitate the spread of that particular message to specific target audiences. We should, to the full extent possible, leverage the full spectrum of marketing technologies to include the assessment piece. You know at a fine grain that as a company engages in a strategy associated with advertising and marketing, that they know in specific detail, how effective that is or how ineffective it is. We're not there. So at a nation state level, as we look at, in this great power competition, we are free and open societies based upon democratic institutions. We believe that gives us great strength and power. But that message is not necessarily getting to those that may accept a Faustian bargain with a totalitarian autocratic state,
right,
or that way of governing. So there is an information fight about which is, Winston Churchill, I think, famously said that, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Yeah, I
right?
like that one too. Yeah.
And it's true. We've got some rough edges, and we've got aspects of our free and open cultures and societies that are sometimes not as would not necessarily be considered to be desirable in some respects to other individuals in other nation states. But the flip side of that is, if we look at what's transpiring in totalitarian and autocratic states, I think we have a very compelling argument if we can get the message out proactively across the global community, working closely with and act back to partners, our traditional, our allies and traditional partners that embrace democratic institutions and freedoms and civil liberties.
Yeah, it's a beautiful mess. It's, I guess, kind of like family, families are challenging, but, it's family. You just said a lot there. And I just wanted to follow up on one point, and you've got a deep computer science background, so you're probably able to talk about this kind of thing extemporaneously. Private sector and their marketing efforts, they've got it a little bit easier in some sense because their marketing efforts are attributable, they're overt typically, and they can measure the effectiveness a lot better. I'm not saying it's trivial or easy, but they can measure revenue and increases or decreases to the bottom line, or even social media engagement with their advertising and perception management efforts. Whereas in great power competition, information operations, where things are much less attributable, it's much harder to ferret out what is a true signal or what's an amplified signal. It's not a beautiful mess. What are your thoughts on measuring the effectiveness of information operations? And we didn't talk about this in advance, so this is not a PhD dissertation defense, but what's your hot take on all that?
Yeah, so if I could, you did mention, let me start off with this. This is fraught with challenge and potential third rail type activities, right? Because what we're talking about here is influence. And when people hear influence and they hear the federal government, because of who we are and as a people, and frankly, why we became a people, there's great skepticism, legitimately skepticism about the role that a federal government should play with respect to influencing others.
Sure.
And so
stipulated.
Yes. So I just want to make sure that's up front.
You bet.
Before I make the following assertion. We're at a place now where we have the means technically to discern a subject's emotional and cognitive state in fine grain, right? And using a variety of technologies. Now, frankly, our marketing tech or ad tech, they use engagement in terms of click-through rates and those sorts of things. But we now have the means through which, again, using a variety of technologies, whether it be with the systems that we're engaging with, that those systems can discern our cognitive emotional state, and using a variety of really simple sensor technologies, whether it be video, whether it be assessing an audio. The voice channel is rich with content. The rate of speech, the intonation, the dynamic range gives you right now and your listeners gives a sense of where I am cognitively, emotionally, right? So very different than if I'm typing this in, right? So, but it goes well beyond that. We can do things like eye gaze and pupil dilation. We can do skin connectivity. We can do baseball cap EEG analytics. And this all sounds very scary. I'm acknowledging that. But at the same time, if we develop these technologies, we can use them to enhance our engagement with systems. So the field of affective, with an A, affective computing, I think is very interesting, very exciting, and will allow us to get some real insights into how given stimuli impacts and influences individuals. Now, again, we need to be very cautious as we go down this path. We need to be on the firmest ethical grounds. We need to have all of the appropriate IRBs in place as we conduct and engage in those sorts of in research in those areas. But I think it's going to be potentially very promising in terms of being able to combat the misuse of these media, this means through which we're engaging with the world, because we can better understand how we might be manipulated, for example, by the presentation of images or stimuli that would push us into a place that's counter to veracity, counter to the truth, counter to where we need to be. So that, in my mind, is an area where we have to account for the inherent risk of engaging in these activities, doing this research, but at the same time, not be surprised that, for example, our adversaries are doing similar research, but without the ethical constraints that we have. We can't wake up one day and find ourselves very surprised when they have a very sophisticated means through which to discern the degree to which they can manipulate U.S. citizens, for example, in a way that the better we understand it, the better we can combat the inherent manipulation or weaponization, if you will, of those particular ways of directly influencing small groups and or individuals in the information domain.
Yeah, 100% on all that. Before I let you go, Rags, you mentioned this book, Unrestricted Warfare. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. Are there any other books or online resources that you might recommend to the audience that they might not be aware of that would make for good bedside reading or PME?
Yeah, so basically anything my dear classmate, Jimmy McConville, he's the Chief of Staff of the Army. He's written about, he's in the press and some Army type documents related to how we're in the midst, the Army in particular, but the department more generally is in the midst of a revolution in military affairs. And we've heard that term for years, but if you think about it, about every 30 or 40 years, if you really think of all of that, what transpired prior to the First World War, and certainly in the 40s as we were engaged in that second large global war. And then in the 80s for the Army, we revolutionized the Army in the 80s. Now we're 40 years since, and I think that we are in the midst of a revolution where we have to rapidly modernize. But in addition to anything Jimmy McConville, again, dear classmate of mine, has been nothing but kind to me. There's Christian Brose wrote The Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. He was a former John McCain staffer. And I think he brings some real insight. It's not, I think it's now 2 or maybe even 3 years old, but much of what he wrote about in there is very much along the lines of my own thinking about the threat is very real. And we have woken up to the threat. And I really want to end with this. If I said I'm bullish because we've got reforms in place that will allow us to be more rapid and responsive in the presence of the emerging threats. Speed is life. And anything that can knock down obstacles and barriers for us to rapidly deploy advanced capabilities, we need to put in place. And I'm not going to go down a long list of all the reforms that are in place or ongoing reforms, but anything that can help us move faster, anything that can help us get away from platform centricity. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I did want to mention that the services love their platforms, and we do love our services. But if we could take a step back, and I'm actually quite enthusiastic about the joint warfighter concept, which some of the details, of course, by its very nature, are classified, but there is some open source discussion of that particular concept. I would encourage your listeners to track the joint warfighter concept and the degree to which the joint staff is driving change from that will move away from platform centricity and try to get our head around how we can have overmatching capability in the out years.
All right. Some fantastic suggestions there. And with that, Dr. Daniel Ragsdale, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
What a great pleasure it's been. I really appreciate your work and look forward to your future guests. Thanks so much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.